Would you pray with me? Good and gracious God, we give you thanks for the words of Jesus, which come to us handed on with love and power and faithfulness from generation to generation. And we give you thanks for the living presence of Jesus Christ, who continues to speak to the church today. Let us hear and understand. Let us receive and believe. Let us follow in the way of Jesus. Now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all our hearts be acceptable in thy sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Kiss the face of Mallory Smith, and you would taste salt. Mallory has salt on her skin and salt in her soul. Mallory loved to be in the salt water of the ocean, but excess salt on her skin was a symptom of her disease. She was born with 2 of one particular gene, and it led her to have cystic fibrosis. CF is a chronic genetic disease that interrupts the flow of salt in and out of the body's cells. This causes the mucus that is naturally present in our bodies to become dehydrated, thick, and viscous. The sticky mucus builds up, causing problems with respiratory, digestive, reproduction, and endocrine systems. And it leads to a vicious cycle of infection, inflammation, and scarring that leads often to respiratory failure, the most common cause of death in CF patients. In her memoir, Salt in My Soul, Mallory writes, "Salt is part and parcel of the cystic fibrosis experience. CF patients lose so much salt in our sweat that we can get water intoxication from drinking normal water unless we add salt to our water and our food. And salty water helps counteract some of the worst symptoms of the disease. I've noticed the healing effects of salt water since I was a little girl swimming in the ocean. I feel as if there is salt in my soul." Mallory Smith was diagnosed when she was 3 years old. Daily, painful treatments shaped her childhood. Her teenage years were interrupted by medication protocols and multiple hospitalizations. Her young adulthood was marked by increasing limitations and labored breathing that became worse as an antibiotic-resistant strain of virus left her lungs scarred and prone to bursts of heavy bleeding. Mallory knew the ticking time clock of the unusually short life of a CF patient. In Salt in My Soul, she wrote, "I wonder, will this be the time? Will this be the time when the blood spilling out of my lungs and out of my mouth will burst forth so fast I can't breathe? The time when I'll be passed out on the floor by the time the ambulance arrives, the time it isn't just a scare, but the final swift, deadly bullet." Mallory wrote her memoir, she says, partly to come to terms with her identity and her sense of purpose. Who would she be since she had salt in her soul? In our gospel reading, Jesus tells us who we are and what we are good for. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything but to be thrown underfoot and trampled. What is Jesus trying to tell us about salt? Cystic fibrosis patients remind us salt serves all sorts of purposes. Salt accentuates, flavors, softens water, balances our body chemistry. It eases swelling, dehydrates, cleans, and preserves. It can also ruin, abrade, and irritate. Salt is necessary for life and enhances our living. But it can also be used for bad purposes. Jesus tells us we are salt. We already are what we are made to be. We are not encouraged to be salt. We are not to aspire to be salt. We do not become salt so that God will love us. We are salt. It can be astonishingly hard to accept our identity as the salt of the earth, that necessary and amazing thing, because the world around us is filled with voices pushing us to accept other identities. Mallory Smith was an unusually intelligent, athletic, capable, funny, and enthusiastic young woman. She swam competitively, graduated from Stanford University with a degree in biology, and wrote a book on sustainable gardening before she was 24. As she lived with CF and its debilitating demands, people around her, students, doctors, researchers, parents, and teachers, were often astounded by her poise and drive under difficult circumstances. They called her an inspiration. People who knew how gravely ill she was were also deeply saddened by her plight and would call her a victim. And sometimes Mallory felt that way also. But Mallory did not want to be an inspiration or a victim. She wanted her true identity. She wrote, "I've spent a lot more time than I would like wrestling with demons, wasting precious energy, suffering with problems derived from feeling like a victim. My life is constantly changing, and that's difficult. That's what CF does. People have also always called me an inspiration, but I'm not. I do sweat the small stuff just like everyone else. I just happen to also have to sweat the big life or death stuff. I don't want constant, unwavering happiness. I want perspective. I don't want to numb the experience of pain. I want to be resilient. I'm just a person grounded in compassion, striving to achieve empathy, and wanting to make my way with goodness and grace." Mallory claimed who she was despite disease and hardship. Through it, maybe even because of it, she knew her identity. Jesus makes a statement about our identity. He tells us we are the salt of the earth. We are to enhance, we can embitter. We are to soothe, we can irritate. We are to preserve, we can ruin. What we do with our saltiness makes a great deal of difference in our lives and in the world. When Jesus tells us we are the salt of the earth, Jesus is telling us who we are, and that who we are is valuable. It is easy to miss that last point about our value in this time and place when salt is readily accessible and relatively cheap. But Jesus' first listeners know how precious salt is. Remember the people to whom Jesus was speaking. They were the people Jesus blessed there on the mountain. Jesus spoke to the poor, the mournful, the meek, the persecuted, the hungry, the sick, the disabled. Jesus was speaking to his disciples and the disreputable and the downcast. You, Jesus told them, are essential and worthy. You who are not well or well-fed, you who are uneducated and illiterate, you who have been rejected and forgotten, you are the salt of the earth. Mallory, in her life, noticed those who were the salt of the earth. In her memoir, she doesn't just call out the reputable and well-trained and impressive doctors who cared for her. She notices the nurses and names one who washed her hair in the ICU when she could not get out of bed. She calls out housekeepers and transporters, EKG techs, cafeteria workers, cashiers. She sees the saltiness of families of patients, her own and others. Mallory treasures friends who show up when she is full of energy and laughing and fun, and when she is sick and sedated. She remarks on the value of other CF patients, those who get out of the hospital ahead of her, those who give her a virtual air high five when she can make it down the hospital corridor with a tank and a wheelchair behind her, and they are still in their rooms. And those too weak and vulnerable to communicate except over text. Jesus notices us and tells us we are valuable. Regrettably, some of us spend months and years trying to earn divine favor, believing our piety or good works might someday make us precious enough for God to love. Jesus spoke to those on the mountaintop who did not consider them worthwhile. He called them a precious commodity. And he is still saying that to us today. Jesus says we are salt of the earth because salt does its best work when it is poured out, when it is scattered, when it dissolves into and becomes part of what it is around. Salt isn't meant to cluster up in a bunch. It's meant to share its unique flavor, to bring out the best that is surrounding it. If we want to bring life, cleanse, and preserve the world we live in, we cannot hide away in our homes, in our churches. Salt doesn't exist to preserve itself. If it does, it loses its flavor. But that's a temptation we face again and again, to retreat, to hide, to hold on to what we have or who we are, to choose blandness over boldness. In Mallory's memoir, her mother recounts a story of people boldly pouring out their saltiness in a practical way I think we can relate to. After increasing bouts of severe illness, Mallory was finally placed on a waiting list for a double lung transplant. She was underweight and undernourished, weak and nauseated, struggling to breathe. And trying to get calories into Mallory, one day her mom drove them to a favorite ice cream shop. They parked in a handicap space across the street from the shop. Inside the store, though, Mom looked out and saw that a tow truck was ready to drive away with their car. She ran out across the street and told the driver she had a handicap placard. All the paperwork was in the glove compartment, and it was because of her daughter's serious medical condition. And the driver says, "I don't care what your daughter has. You can have your car for $200 cash right now." Mallory's mom said she didn't carry that kind of cash around with her, and the driver said, "You can get your car from the impound lot." By now, Mallory had emerged from the ice cream shop with her oxygen tank and 2 IVs running. Mom explained Mallory was waiting for a lung transplant. She was weak. It would be impossible to get her home without the car, and the driver pulled away nonetheless. Mom was frantically calling 911, explaining the situation to the police, when suddenly the truck stopped, backed up, and lowered the car. Mallory's mom hung up, ran up to the driver's window to thank him, but he roared away before she could reach him. Stunned, Mom and Mallory were trying to take this all in, and they saw 4 people watching the spectacle. And Mallory's mom sort of gushed to them that she was so thankful that the driver had changed his mind and left the car. One of them said, "Don't thank him. He got $200 in cash." We know there's a lot of expenses before and after a transplant. Use that money where you can. And they faded into the sidewalk. Mallory's mom remembers these salt of the earth people who anonymously and generously poured out what they had. So what are we, who Jesus calls precious salt, to do? We are called to pour out our saltiness generously where it is needed. In his Sermon on the Mount, Jesus makes concrete the work of love. It is compassion, healing, and justice. It's not enough simply to believe. It's not enough to bask in all the blessedness while all around us, God's people are in pain. Salt sustains and enriches. It pours itself out so God's way on earth, health and wholeness, mercy and justice, spice and flavor, can be alive. To be followers of Jesus Christ is to live into our identity as blessed, precious salt. We have salt in our souls to be poured out. When we scatter our goodness in real and practical, life-changing ways, the world is alight with the love of God. Mallory Smith died shortly after her 25th birthday, 2 months and 2 days after receiving a double lung transplant. She knew her identity and her purpose. I feel like people with CF are privy to secrets it takes most other people a lifetime to understand. How lucky we are to be alive, that we can leave behind a legacy when we go that will impact others, that love and happiness are the most important things to strive for, that everyone is facing different struggles that others aren't aware of. CF has given me my value system, and ultimately, no matter how hard it is, I'm grateful. Jesus tells you, you are the salt of the earth. That's who you are. You are essential. You are precious. Now pour yourself out generously where you are needed for God's purposes. When the world kisses your life, it will taste like salt. You have salt in your soul.